Hello, everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. It was March 9, 2023, just past 1 a.m., when I woke up in the cabin. The wind was rattling the windows, snow scraping against the sides of the structure, and the usual quiet of the mountains pressed in on all sides. My friends were still asleep in the loft above, the soft sounds of breathing and the occasional shuffle of blankets the only indication that the place wasn't completely empty. I was thirsty, my throat dry from the heated air, and I swung my legs out of bed, feeling the chill of the floor against my feet as I padded down the ladder. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and old wood, the kind of scent you notice only when everything else is silent, when the world outside has faded to white and black. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the stove clock and the weak silver of moonlight filtering through the windows. I opened the fridge, poured a glass of water, and paused when I noticed a tiny red glare blinking in the corner, just under the edge of the bottom shelf. It was small, too small to be a smoke detector or anything standard. I crouched down, squinting, trying to figure out what it was, my breath fogging slightly in the cold air. My fingers reached under, and I pulled out a little micro camera, taped meticulously to the underside of the shelf, aimed directly at the ladder to the loft. A night vision lens, a motion sensor, all designed to catch whoever climbed up or down at night. My stomach sank. I froze for a moment, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps a maintenance crew had installed some kind of security measure and forgotten to tell us. But it didn't feel like that. The camera was small, hidden, deliberately placed. My mind started moving through possibilities too quickly, and I felt a chill that wasn't just from the winter air. I ran my hands over the other shelves, the counters, the corners of the kitchen. One by one, I found 4 more, all hidden in similar ways under counters, behind small decorative carvings, tucked between the edges of cabinets. They weren't obvious at first glance, but once you knew what to look for, their placement made sense. Every corner, every access point, a perfect view of where people slept, where they changed, where they spent the evening. The realization hit slowly, like ice in my veins. There had been no break-in, no sign of forced entry, nothing disturbed. The locks hadn't been tampered with, and all the windows were closed, the doors bolted. Whoever had set this up had a key, or access to the cabin before we arrived. A knowledge of the layout and timing. They had watched us without our knowledge, planned where to place each camera, to catch us at the most private moments. The thought of someone having spent time in the cabin while we were elsewhere, deciding exactly where to plant surveillance devices, felt unbearably close and personal. I moved through the cabin slowly, checking every angle I could think of. The living room, the shelves by the fireplace, the backs of the chairs, the beams overhead. It was unnerving to notice how easily the space could be turned into a watch point. Everything familiar suddenly felt like it had an undercurrent I hadn't noticed before. The warmth of the fire pit, the stack of blankets in the corner, the way the loft ladder creaked just slightly when you climbed it. All of it could have been observed, recorded, cataloged. I kept thinking about the nights we'd spent here before, how we laughed in the loft, changing into pajamas, moving about without a care. That footage existed somewhere. Somewhere, someone had it. I went back to the kitchen and sat on the cold tile floor, feeling the wood grain of the cabinets against my back. The thought of reporting it was there immediately, but even that came with a strange sense of futility. We could call the police, file a report, hope they could trace something. But the cameras had been planted and the footage already existed. There was no way to retrieve it, no way to know who had done this. The only thing we could do was remove them, and even then, the intrusion had already happened. Every memory of that weekend suddenly felt exposed, violated in a way I couldn't fix. By the time I went back upstairs, the first traces of dawn were creeping over the mountains, pale blue light glimmering on the snow. I didn't wake anyone. They were still asleep, unaware that every motion of their night, every private moment had been captured. I gathered the cameras carefully, taped them together so I could show them to the authorities, and tucked them in a bag. The cabin felt different, as though its walls themselves had shifted, becoming a little colder, a little more watchful. Sitting on the loft floor, I could hear the soft groan of the structure as it settled in the morning cold. Later that day, we called the local sheriff. The cameras were examined, removed, and logged. The investigation was thorough in a bureaucratic way, but ultimately went nowhere. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no indication of when the devices had been placed other than that it was before our arrival. The cabin had been accessed with a key, or someone had knowledge of its security and schedule. No suspects were identified. The idea that whoever had done this could still be watching the footage lingered, a persistent shadow that didn't dissipate. We changed the locks, added extra security, but the knowledge remained someone had been inside our private space, had chosen exactly where and how to see us, and it could happen again. The rest of the weekend passed without incident, but the feeling never fully left me. Sitting by the window, looking out at the pines and the slopes blanketed in snow, I kept imagining someone watching from the shadows, the cameras hidden just out of sight, recording silently. It wasn't a constant fear, but a weight in the background of every movement, every private action. I learned to move through the cabin with awareness I hadn't needed before, checking corners, tapping shelves, scanning angles for blind spots. Even now, years later, I remember that night vividly. The quiet hum of the cabin in winter, the smell of pine and old wood, the small red glows blinking under the shelves, the sensation of someone else being present without ever stepping into the room. The intrusion was intimate, precise, and inescapable. We were safe physically, but the cameras meant that the most private parts of our lives had been captured, watched by someone who would never be identified. It was a violation that left no visible scars, but left the space around me feeling altered forever. And the reality that always comes back is this: the footage still exists. Somewhere, someone has it. Someone knows every laugh, every stretch of sleep, every quiet moment of that weekend. They might have watched it, or might not. But the thought that it is out there, accessible, untraceable, is a reminder that safety and privacy are fragile, sometimes only illusions. We left the cabin with locks changed and cameras gone, but nothing could erase the certainty that our most private actions had been recorded without our knowledge. That knowledge clings quietly, in the back of the mind, a shadowed reminder that even familiar places, even those we think of as safe, can be turned into a space where we are always being watched. The story ends there, fully contained, but the weight remains. We survived, we were unharmed, and the authorities did what they could. The cameras are gone, the cabin remains ours to use, but the certainty that someone once had access, that they recorded us, that the footage exists somewhere is permanent. That is the reality. The rest is simply the ongoing quiet of winter in the mountains, where the pine trees are indifferent and the snow covers everything, and yet some truths can never be fully erased. I woke up in the middle of the night to the faint hum of the geothermal vents that surround this cabin. The air was warmer than I expected, a damp, earthy heat that seeped through the floorboards and walls. I knew the lake was just beyond the glass wall, but in the dark it was impossible to see much beyond the reflection of the room. The moon was high and bright, spilling silvery light across the floor, and I could see my own shadow stretching long and thin. It was just past 3 a.m. when I decided I needed a drink of water, or maybe I just needed to move and wake up a little. The cabin was silent except for the occasional hiss of steam from the ground, and the smell of sulfur was strong, almost sharp but oddly comforting in its familiarity. I walked across the cold timber floor to the small bathroom area. The glass wall of the cabin was behind me, the lake lying still and dark beyond it, the far shore just a silhouette of trees against the night sky. I turned on the tiny sink and ran some water to brush my teeth, the sound startling in the quiet. I was still half asleep, my eyes blurry from fatigue, when I looked up into the mirror. At first, everything seemed normal. My own face stared back at me, pink and foamy from the toothpaste, my hair sticking up in odd angles from sleep. Then, in the corner of my reflection, I thought I saw movement. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was just a trick of the light or the reflection of the moon on the glass. I blinked and focused, and there it was again. Another figure, standing behind me in the mirror. It wasn't moving, just standing, tall and still, as if it had always been there. My heart started to race, and I turned slowly in place, trying not to make a sound, to see the other person in the room. But there was nothing. The loft ladder leading up to the sleeping area was empty, the sleeping bag on the floor undisturbed. No one had been hiding. The cabin was as quiet and empty as it had been before I started brushing my teeth. My breath came fast in the stillness, echoing off the walls, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck rise. I forced myself to look back at the glass wall, half expecting the second figure to still be there. But it wasn't. Just my reflection this time, foamy and pale in the moonlight. The sense of unease lingered, though, a heavy weight pressing in around my chest. I brushed my teeth slowly, deliberately, trying to keep my gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to look over my shoulder again. My hand moved mechanically, but my mind was alert, scanning every shadow and corner of the room. The reflection had been wrong. It had to have been wrong. There was no one else in the cabin, and yet the certainty I had felt in that moment was so sharp it made my stomach twist. I rinsed my mouth and stepped back from the sink, the tiles cold under my bare feet. The air was damp and smelled of wet wood and sulfur, a constant reminder of the geothermal activity beneath the cabin. I turned toward the glass wall, studying it carefully this time. The moonlight made the reflection clear, but it also gave me a view of the lake outside, dark and still. The surface unbroken. No movement, no figures. Nothing but the still water and the trees on the far shore, black against the sky. I leaned against the counter lightly, taking slow, deep breaths, and tried to make sense of what I had seen. It had been a reflection, but not just a reflection of the room. Something about it had been wrong. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't shifted like a normal reflection would with the light. It had been there and then gone, just like that, without explanation. I walked back across the floor, the wood creaking slightly under my weight. The cabin felt alive in the silence, every small sound exaggerated. The faint groan of the beam settling, the hiss of steam through the vents, the occasional drip of condensation from the ceiling. I sat down on the edge of the sleeping bag and let my hands rest on my knees. The warmth from the geothermal vents made the cabin feel like a pressure cooker, thick with heat and sulfur. My heart was still pounding, and I tried to calm it, telling myself that this was just isolation playing tricks on my mind. The cabin is small, the light is strange, the reflection in the glass is confusing. That has to be it. There is no one else here. I stared at the lake through the glass for a long time, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The moonlight made the water shimmer slightly, and I could see small ripples from a breeze, but nothing else. The reflection of the room stared back at me like a second skin, perfect and unbroken. I thought about the moment I had seen the figure, and slowly the memory of it began to lose its edge, becoming more like a half-remembered dream than a real event. Still, the feeling of being watched, of having something exist in the reflection but not in reality, lingered in my chest. It was disorienting, but it wasn't fear of the supernatural. It was the kind of fear that comes from being completely alone in a strange place, surrounded by the quiet hum of a living, breathing earth. I spent the next hour sitting quietly, watching the moonlight shift across the floor and the wall. My eyes wandered between the reflection and the lake, taking in the textures of the room, the grain of the timber, the small scratches on the counter, the faint dampness where condensation had formed overnight. Every detail was amplified in the silence, and I became aware of how sensitive my senses had grown in the dark. The cabin had a strange way of making you notice everything, making every sound and shadow feel significant, even when it wasn't. Eventually, exhaustion overcame the tension, and I lay back on the sleeping bag, facing away from the glass. The heat of the floor had made the air feel heavy, but it was comforting in a strange way, like a cocoon. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady hiss of the vents, the distant call of a bird or insect, the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. The sensation of being completely alone, surrounded by vast empty space and quiet, was intense but oddly peaceful. There were no ghosts, no hidden figures, only my own mind and the strange distortions of reflection and light. Isolation was enough. It made the hair on my arms rise and my heart beat faster, but it also made the night memorable, alive in a way that daylight never could replicate. By the time I finally fell asleep, the strange memory of the reflection had faded into a vague unease, more like a story I would tell myself in the future than something that had really happened. The cabin continued to breathe around me, the vents hissing, the woods settling, the lake shifting imperceptibly outside. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling across the floor, warm and golden, and the cabin felt entirely normal. The reflection was just a reflection, the figure never real. I packed up my things slowly, taking in the details one last time, noticing how the air smelled sharper in daylight, how the glass wall was just glass, how the lake was just a lake. The memory of the night stayed with me, vivid in its quiet intensity, a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling experiences don't come from what's hidden, but from what's visible when you are utterly alone. I left the cabin that morning feeling a strange combination of relief and awe. The night had been unsettling, yes, but it had also been grounding, a pure, unvarnished encounter with isolation. There were no tricks, no supernatural forces, just the raw awareness of being utterly alone in a space that had nothing but itself to offer. And that, I realized, was more than enough to make a night unforgettable. It was February 2018, and the morning arrived with a sharp, piercing cold that seemed to seep through the walls of the small hunting cabin I had rented near the Black Fork River in Haskell County, Oklahoma. I woke earlier than usual, around 6:12 a.m., the chill gnawing at my fingertips even under layers of blankets. The thermometer on the wall read 17 degrees C, a figure that didn't surprise me given the week, long stretch of winter cold that had gripped the area. I had expected snow and ice, but nothing prepared me for the smell that hit me the moment I opened my eyes, a strange, metallic tang mixed with the mustiness of damp, frozen wood. It was faint at first, but sharp enough to make me sit up slowly, blinking through the dim gray light filtering through the frost-laced windows. I noticed the condensation immediately. The ceiling, made of thin, rough-cut pine, had tiny droplets forming in clusters, like the cabin itself was sweating. I leaned back, my breath forming a mist in the cold air, and tried to reason through it. The cabin was insulated, or at least it was supposed to be. There shouldn't have been any moisture like that. No pipes were leaking, and the snow outside hadn't melted in the night. My eyes adjusted, and I saw it. The roof was sagging. Not cracked, not torn, but bowed down in the center as if something extremely heavy had settled there. The angle was subtle at first, easy to miss, but the closer I looked, the more pronounced it became. The beams beneath the ceiling strained under the weight, bending in a way that made the cabin feel suddenly fragile. A dull panic settled in my stomach. I had chosen the place for solitude, a simple structure just off the beaten path, far enough from the road that it felt isolated but still reachable. I had been careful about checking the weather, the structure, the accessibility, everything. And now, in the pale early light, the cabin seemed precarious, like a small box under some invisible pressure. My hands shook slightly as I slipped into boots and a thick jacket, layering as many clothes as I could before stepping outside. The snow was pristine, a pure white layer over the ground and the surrounding trees. The Black Fork River was partially frozen, the ice forming uneven patches across the surface, the water beneath moving with a low, muffled roar. I exhaled slowly, trying to collect my thoughts, and that's when I looked up at the roof. Snow clung to it, heavy and powdery, but the surface told a story. Deep, irregular indentations pressed into the white blanket, spaced unevenly but clearly deliberate. Some were large, broad, as though a palm had sunk into the snow, while others were smaller, the size of knees. The pattern was awkward, awkwardly human in movement, as if someone or something had moved across the roof on all fours, careful not to slide or fall, pressing each limb into the surface with enough force to leave a mark. There was no snow sliding down the eaves, no sign of a tree branch collapsing or falling debris. The snow was still perfectly layered everywhere else. Whoever had been there, they had left those impressions intentionally, and they had done so without leaving any other trace. The thought that someone could have been on my roof, in the middle of the night, tightened my chest. The area was remote, a stretch of forested hills with only the cabin and a few tracks from hunters or hikers months prior. I had been the only person there for 2 nights. Footprints would have been visible in the snow leading to or from the cabin, yet there were none. The snow was untouched, a perfect, unbroken sheet across the clearing. I walked around the cabin slowly, each step sinking slightly, the cold snow biting through my boots, eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. Nothing, just the silent trees, the frozen river, and the stark, empty white of the landscape. I remembered reading about cabin collapses in heavy snow, stories of roofs giving way under weight, and I ran my hands along the rough wood siding, trying to feel if anything had shifted or creaked. Nothing. Yet the metal smell persisted, faint but insistent, and I realized it was coming from above. Not from the roof itself, but from the beams under pressure, bending under some weight that had been placed there and removed. There was no wind, no recent storm to explain the marks or the sagging, only the impossible suggestion that something had been there. Something had climbed onto my roof while I slept, careful, deliberate, leaving the impression of hands and knees in the snow, yet leaving no other trace. I thought about the timing, 17 greedy C, dead of night, and someone, or something, had been able to climb up there and move carefully across the roof without slipping or leaving any other marks. The possibilities ran through my mind, logical and impossible at the same time. Was it an animal? No, the spacing was too long, too deliberate, the weight too evenly distributed for any known animal in the region. Humans. A trespasser. Maybe, but then where were the footprints? How did they get up there, climb in the dark, and move with such precision on a roof covered in snow and ice? My stomach tightened, a combination of cold and adrenaline, and I realized I couldn't stay inside another second. I began packing quietly, methodical, as if my actions might keep me invisible, careful not to make a sound that might draw attention. I didn't turn on the engine at first, leaving the car cold, letting the heat come slowly, because I didn't want to risk standing outside while something was above me. Every instinct told me to keep moving, to stay away from the roof, to treat the entire cabin as unstable. I loaded my belongings with deliberate slowness, checking the windows, the door, the walls for any indication of entry, anything that would suggest someone had been inside while I slept. Nothing. It was untouched, immaculate in its decay, as if it had been abandoned for decades and only I had returned to disturb it. Once inside the car, I sat for a moment, the heater kicking on weakly, fogging the windows. I looked back at the cabin, at the roof that had borne some unseen weight, and I felt the tension in my chest begin to loosen. The roof hadn't collapsed. The structure hadn't failed. It was still there, holding against whatever pressure it had been subjected to. Whatever had climbed across it had left no further trace, had not attempted to enter the cabin, had not followed me. I drove away slowly, my boots scraping the snow, tires crunching against the frozen ground. The landscape of bare trees and thick snow stretched out around me, empty and silent, except for the distant gurgle of the partially frozen river. I glanced back once more at the cabin, the bow in its roof now almost imperceptible from a distance. The metal scent lingered faintly in my nose, but it was fading with every mile. I didn't stop until the forest and river were well behind me, the road clear, the sun rising pale and distant over the horizon. When I finally reached a small town and warmed up in a diner, sipping coffee, I tried to piece it together rationally. Someone had been on that roof, somehow without leaving footprints or breaking snow elsewhere. Perhaps a hunter, perhaps a prankster, perhaps something I didn't understand. Whatever it was, it had chosen not to enter the cabin. It had chosen not to follow, and it had been patient enough to leave only evidence of its presence in a way that was tangible yet ultimately harmless. The roof was fine. I was fine. I was unharmed. I never went back to that cabin. I never tried to understand the indentations or the bowed roof in more detail. The memory stayed with me, vivid, like a quiet warning. But I understood it finally, in the only way that made sense. Whatever had been up there, it had been careful, it had observed, and it had moved on. It wasn't malevolent, it wasn't aggressive, it was deliberate, patient, and perhaps as cautious of me as I was of it. And that in itself was terrifying enough. The road home was clear, the cold fading slowly, and with the sun climbing higher, I allowed myself to relax. The cabin, the snow, the roof. All of it remained behind me, a story etched in memory. I would remember the smell, the sagging ceiling, the impressions in the snow, but I would never return. Some mysteries, I realized, are best left unresolved, and some warnings are best heeded in silence. December 2021 started like any other trip to the Ozarks. My girlfriend and I had been planning this cabin getaway for months, wanting to escape the city for a few days of quiet. Camden County in Missouri is beautiful in winter. The trees are bare, skeletal branches stretching against gray skies, the lake frozen in patches, mist rising off the water in the early mornings. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already low, casting long shadows across the snow. Dusted gravel road leading to the cabin. The structure was small, rustic, and tucked into a clearing surrounded by thick woods. The kind of place that feels removed from everything. The wooden siding was weathered, the roof lined with frozen needles and leaves, and a single lamp by the door gave off a faint orange glow. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp pine, a mixture that felt comforting at first. We dropped our bags and unpacked slowly, enjoying the silence of the forest around us. There were creaks and groans in the floorboards as the temperature dropped, which I assumed were normal settling noises. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and I noticed patches of mud frozen into jagged shapes where snow had melted during the day. Inside, everything seemed ordinary: a small kitchen, a bed pushed against one wall, and a trapdoor in the rear corner of the room that led to the crawl space. It was old, heavy, and had a rusted latch that resisted the pull until it gave way with a dull click. We didn't pay it much attention, assuming it was just a storage space. The first night passed uneventfully. We ate dinner, drank tea, and fell asleep under heavy blankets. Around 2 a.m, I woke to a faint scratching sound. At first, I assumed it was a branch scraping against the cabin siding, a raccoon, or some small animal trying to find warmth. It was subtle, rhythmic, and slow. I listened, holding my breath, and the sound persisted closer now, not outside, under the bed. My heart started beating faster, though I tried to tell myself it was just mice. But as the scratching became more deliberate, almost frantic, it didn't resemble anything I'd heard before. The nails were too sharp, too deliberate, and the rhythm was wrong for rodents. The scraping stopped and started again, a pattern that seemed almost patient. I nudged my girlfriend awake, whispering that I thought something was under the bed. She stayed still, wide-eyed, the room cold around us. The scratching grew louder, as if testing the edges of the bed frame, moving with purpose. There was no scurrying, no squeaks, only the dragging, sharp sound of nails against wood. I realized immediately it wasn't an animal. The scratching was calculated, repeated, and unnervingly slow, almost like it was meant to get noticed. I tried to imagine a rational explanation. Someone trapped, someone hiding. But the thought was too heavy to form fully in the darkness. My stomach sank. We got out of bed carefully, shoes crunching softly against the floorboards. The cabin felt different now, smaller and colder. I went to the rear of the room, where the trapdoor to the crawlspace sat. My hand shook as I unlatched it, and a wave of cold, damp air hit my face. The smell was immediate: earth, mud, sweat, and something else I couldn't name at first. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it down the narrow opening. At first, I saw only darkness, packed dirt, and wooden beams. Then a hand shot up, shielding itself from the light, pale against the mud. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to step back, to run, to get out. My flashlight trembled in my grip. The hand moved aside slowly, revealing a face pressed into the dirt, eyes wide, mud caked across skin and broken fingernails. The man was small, his body curled into the tight crawl space, shaking and whispering something I couldn't make out. His lips moved rapidly, a low murmuring, almost mechanical in its repetition. I could see the jagged cuts on his knuckles, dirt under his nails, streaks of dried blood mixing with the mud. The smell was overwhelming now. The damp cabin, and his sweat merging into something suffocating. I didn't ask him who he was or what he was doing. I couldn't. I just knew I needed to get out of that room. My legs moved on their own, backing toward the door, and I grabbed my girlfriend's hand. We didn't speak, didn't try to rationalize. The man didn't follow. didn't react beyond the shaking and murmuring, still pressed into the earth of the crawl space, small and human and terrifying. We ran out into the cold night air, shivering and gasping. The snow crunching under our shoes sounded impossibly loud. I slammed the cabin door behind us and didn't look back. The wind cut through the trees, sharp and bitter, but it felt safer than being inside. We drove immediately to the main reception of the cabin rental area, 40 minutes on roads that seemed endless in the dark. Every shadow along the side of the road made me flinch. When we finally arrived, we explained what had happened, though I didn't go into detail about the whispers or the state of the man. The staff took our report seriously, but by the time authorities investigated, there was no trace of him. The crawl space was empty, no footprints, nothing to suggest he had been there at all. Weeks later, the cabin owner returned to fill the crawl space entrance with concrete. He told us it was for safety, to prevent animals or intruders from entering, but I never believed it was just precaution. That space, once accessible, had held something human and broken in a way I can't fully understand. I've gone back in my mind to that night countless times, retracing the path, the sound of the nails against the wood, the shaking, the whispering. It was real, and it was entirely human, the most terrifying thing I've ever encountered. No ghosts, no monsters, just a man, hiding and desperate in a place that should have been abandoned and empty. The experience left me shaken. Every time I enter a cabin now, I check for crawl spaces and locked storage, imagining the possibilities of what could be lurking just out of sight. There's a clarity in that fear, though, a recognition that some spaces are better left alone, unentered, and that curiosity sometimes comes at a cost you can't measure. I still can't imagine what he had been doing down there or why he was in such a state, and perhaps it's better that I never do. Some mysteries, some corners of the world, are not meant to be explored. We drove away that night and didn't look back until weeks later, when the concrete sealed the crawl space forever. Even now, I remember the feel of the cold air rushing out of that trapdoor, the way the beam of my flashlight caught the mud-smeared face, the unblinking eyes that seemed to peer right through me. Some spaces, once touched, leave a mark you can never forget. That night in Camden County is one I will never forget, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, something broken and human can be hiding just beneath the floor, waiting. It was late August 2019 in northern Alberta, the kind of place where the forest is dense and the roads are little more than dirt tracks that vanish into the trees. I had been sent up by the Forestry Service to check on some of the ranger storage cabins scattered across the wildfire zones. The cabin I was heading to was nothing fancy, just a small wooden shack set back from the main logging road. It smelled faintly of damp pine and oil. I parked my truck in the shade of a stand of spruce and walked up the narrow path, feeling the heat of the late afternoon sun bouncing off the dirt and rock beneath my boots. The cabin itself was simple. Weathered wood, faded paint, a small tin roof that rattled whenever the wind picked up. Behind it, a metal locker sat on a concrete slab. It had been used to store food and small supplies during fire season. When I got there, it was locked tight with a thick bolt and padlock. I had checked the cabin and the surrounding area. Everything normal, just the scent of the forest and the occasional bird call. The air was dry but heavy with the smell of pine resin, that sharp, almost bitter aroma that makes your nose tingle if you're out in it too long. Around 4 in the afternoon, I noticed the first flies. At first, it was just a few, buzzing lazily in the sun near the corner of the cabin. But within minutes, there were dozens, then hundreds, circling around the metal locker. The noise was subtle at first, a gentle hum, but it thickened until it sounded almost like a faint static, the way radio noise builds before you find a station. I assumed some animal had died nearby. Deer, maybe a raccoon. It wasn't unusual in these woods, especially in late summer when predators had been out hunting and scavenging. The smell hit me next. Not faint, not just something that hinted at decay, but full and powerful, crawling up my nostrils and settling in my sinuses. It was rotting protein, the kind that makes your stomach twist and your throat tighten. I stepped back instinctively, but the flies didn't leave. They clustered, Thick clouds around the locker, like they were drawn to something inside that had no right being there. I bent my knees and leaned closer, trying to figure out what I was smelling. The locker was locked, but not permanently. I had tools in my truck, a small crowbar and a wrench, meant for maintenance work. My hand shook slightly as I approached, the air around me thick and humid even in the late afternoon sun. I forced the bolt, prying at it until it popped with a dull metallic snap. The smell hit stronger the moment I unlatched it. I paused, heart thudding, adrenaline sharpening every sound. Inside was a black trash bag. It didn't look like it had anything small in it, no fur or bones of animals. It was long, oddly heavy, and folded in a way that suggested something rigid inside, something human-shaped. My stomach sank and my hands went cold. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. My body knew what it was before my mind could catch up. I ran. The door of the cabin swung open as I stumbled past it, kicking up dust, heart hammering like it wanted to escape my chest. The flies didn't follow me at first, but their buzzing lingered in my ears. I didn't stop until I was on the dirt road, the kind of lonely track that bends through the trees and disappears over a rise. I wheezed, gasping for air, my legs trembling. My brain raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Who had put that bag there? How long had it been left? And how had no one else found it? I called it in as soon as I could get a signal, pacing along the road. The nearest town was over 20 kilometers away, a cluster of houses and a gas station and nothing more. By the time the investigators arrived, the scene had changed. The locker was closed again, the bolt reattached. There was no sign it had been opened from the inside. The bag was gone. The flies, which had been thick enough to obscure the sun when I looked back, were still there circling, but less frantic. They hovered like satellites, waiting, but for what I couldn't imagine. The police took statements, asked for descriptions. I told them everything exactly as it had happened, down to the first few flies that drew my attention, to the exact smell that had hit me when I lifted the bolt. They took photos, swabbed the area for fingerprints, but the scene yielded nothing. The locker had no signs of forced entry beyond what I had done. The bag, whatever it had contained, had vanished. My mind refused to accept it. Even when I tried to rationalize it, nothing made sense. There were no footprints around the locker large enough to match a human who could have moved it out. No tire tracks, no dragging marks in the dirt, nothing. I stayed until sunset, watching the sky turn a bruised purple behind the trees. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of pine and distant wildfire smoke, clean and sharp, but it couldn't wash out the stench I remembered. I went back to my truck slowly, careful not to disturb anything else, though there was nothing visible. The flies had finally begun to disperse as the light faded, but the hum lingered in my ears. The next day, the investigators returned with more equipment. They opened the locker themselves, finding it completely empty, just as it had been when they first arrived. They measured it, checked the hinges, the latch, the padlock, every inch for anything that could explain how something so large could have disappeared without a trace. There was nothing. No signs of tampering, no hidden compartments, no evidence that the locker had ever contained anything other than what I had seen. I couldn't stop thinking about the bag, how heavy it had been, the way it had held a shape that was unmistakably human. I replayed the moment I forced the bolt, smelled the contents, and ran. I remembered every detail of the air, the dust on the cabin floor, the texture of the metal under my fingers, the buzzing of the flies. I went back to that place mentally, over and over, trying to find a mistake in my memory, a clue I had missed, anything that could explain it away. Months later, I drove past the cabin again on a different assignment. The locker was still there, still bolted shut. The forest had begun to reclaim the clearing around it, grass and weeds poking through the dirt. I stopped for a moment and looked at it. The sun was low in the sky, the smell of pine resin heavy in the air. Nothing moved. The flies were gone. I touched the metal, cold and dull, and felt the same unease I had that day. The memory of the black bag was as vivid as ever, but there was nothing to be done about it. I never found out what was in that bag. No one else did. There were theories, of course. Illegal dumping, a missing person, something left behind by someone who knew the cabin was remote and rarely checked. But in my mind, none of them fully explained it. The speed with which it disappeared, The lack of evidence, the way the flies seemed to know exactly where to hover, all of it defied simple logic. I stopped going to that area alone. Whenever I passed through northern Alberta, I made sure to have company, or I avoided the back roads entirely. The cabin stayed in my mind, not as a curiosity, but as a warning. The memory of the flies, thick and buzzing, circling the locker like they were waiting for coordinates, stays with me. The smell of rotting protein lingers in the corners of my memory, sharp and nauseating, and the shape of the bag, unmistakably human, is something I carry with me every time I step into a quiet, remote space. I never opened another locker after that. I don't force bolts or pry open anything I'm not certain about. Some things are better left alone, I realized, especially in the remote woods where nobody else is around to notice, and some answers aren't meant to be found. The cabin is still there. The locker is still there. But I don't go near them anymore, and I don't think I ever will. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see it, the black bag, the flies, the heavy, impossible smell. I can feel the panic in my chest again, the raw animal terror that ran through me. It was real. It happened. And nothing, not time, not distance, not investigation, has ever made it any less real. The locker is empty. The bag is gone. But I know what I saw, and I know the flies were waiting for something. I drove up the narrow, winding road as the late afternoon sun started to sink behind the ridges of the hills, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a place to escape the constant noise and obligations of everyday life, and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. The GPS hadn't been entirely reliable, and I had to stop more than once to check the map, but eventually I spotted the small wooden structure tucked between a stand of pines and maples. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Weathered wood, a sagging roofline, a small porch that seemed to lean slightly to one side, but there was a charm in the isolation that immediately drew me in. The air smelled sharp and clean, a mix of pine and damp earth, and the sound of a nearby creek added a constant, soothing murmur that contrasted with the usual hum of city life. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell of old wood and something faintly musty, like the cabin hadn't seen consistent use in years. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of light coming through the grimy windows. The interior was sparse but functional, a small kitchen area with a sink and a gas stove, a table with a couple of chairs, a single bed pushed against the far wall, and a tiny bathroom whose floor creaked with every step. It was enough to make me feel both exposed and strangely comfortable, like stepping into a place frozen in time. I dropped my bag on the bed and walked slowly through the cabin, running my hands over the rough wooden surfaces. The walls were covered in a thin layer of grime, and in some spots, the paint had peeled to reveal the raw wood beneath. The windows were streaked, but I could see through them well enough to take in the forest outside. The way the trees seemed to lean toward each other, creating a kind of natural corridor that led down to the creek. I spent the first hour settling in. I pulled blankets from the closet, wiped down the kitchen surfaces, and lit a small fire in the stone fireplace. The logs crackled and sent up sparks that danced along the walls, making the cabin feel warm in a way that the sunlight couldn't achieve alone. I stood by the window and watched the light fade completely, turning the forest into a solid wall of darkness. At that moment, there was no one else around, no sound but the creek, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the crackling of the fire. It was perfect except for the unease that comes when you are alone in a space that has always been someone else's. I tried to ignore it, pouring a cup of coffee and sitting at the table, watching the flames and listening to the silent stretch. As night fell, the isolation started to feel heavier. Shadows from the fire danced along the walls and ceiling, stretching and shrinking in unpredictable ways. The floorboards creaked under my weight more than they had during the day, and every little sound seemed amplified. Outside, a branch scraped against the side of the cabin, sharp and sudden, and I jumped despite myself. I told myself it was normal. The forest was full of wildlife, and the wind shifted unpredictably. But my heart was already picking up its pace. I tried to read, to focus on the book I had brought, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, to the dark outlines of the trees that swayed as if in a slow rhythm, indifferent to my presence. I decided to check the creek. I wrapped a jacket around my shoulders and stepped out into the night, the cold air biting through the fabric. The moon was high, but it barely penetrated the dense canopy, leaving the forest dim and mottled with black patches where the trees blocked the light. The creek was visible through the trees, a thin silver line glinting as it wound down the hillside. I walked slowly, carefully placing my feet on the uneven ground, listening to the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. The sound of the water grew louder as I approached, soothing in its consistency. I knelt beside the bank, tracing the current with my fingers, feeling the icy water slip over my skin. I stayed there longer than I planned, letting the sound of the creek fill the spaces where my thoughts had started to spiral. Returning to the cabin, I felt a flicker of tension I couldn't explain. The door closed behind me with a solid thud, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted while I was outside. The cabin seemed smaller now, the shadows deeper and more uneven. I double-checked the locks, walked from room to room, and reassured myself that it was just my imagination. I lit the fireplace again, although it was unnecessary, and sat back at the table, trying to relax. I focused on mundane tasks, washing a mug, tidying the blankets, checking my pack to make sure I had everything. But the small, nagging feeling of being watched lingered in the corners of my mind. Sleep came fitfully. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind through the trees startled me. I woke more than once, sitting upright and straining my ears. At some point, I heard a different sound, softer and slower, like someone walking in the distance. My pulse quickened, but when I went to the window and looked out, there was nothing. The forest was empty, silent except for the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon moving carefully through the undergrowth. But the fear had settled into my stomach, heavy and insistent. I spent the rest of the night in a half-sleep state, listening, waiting, and counting the hours until the first hint of light. Morning brought a sense of relief. The sun filtered through the trees, turning the forest into shades of green and gold. The cabin felt different in the daylight, less threatening, more like a place to inhabit rather than a trap. I stepped outside and took a long walk, feeling the dirt under my shoes, noticing the texture of the bark on the trees, the way the creek sparkled in the morning sun. The sense of dread from the night before had faded with the light, leaving a kind of reverent awareness of my surroundings. I realized that being alone in a place like this required a balanced respect for the environment, attention to small details, and acceptance that fear is often amplified by darkness and isolation. I spent the day exploring the hillside, making small improvements inside the cabin, and observing the forest. Every sound and movement felt significant, but not threatening. I built a small pile of wood near the fireplace, swept the floor, and washed the dishes, taking satisfaction in these ordinary tasks. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and sat by the window for hours, watching the creek, the trees, and the occasional bird that ventured too close to the cabin. By evening, I had developed a rhythm, a pattern that made the cabin feel inhabitable and the forest less intimidating. When it was time to leave, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The cabin had tested my patience, my composure, and my ability to confront isolation, but it had also offered a kind of solace I hadn't expected. I packed my belongings carefully, leaving the place as I had found it, and took one last walk to the creek, letting the water run through my fingers. The drive down the winding road was serene, the forest gradually giving way to open fields, and then the familiar roads leading back to town. The memory of the night, the shadows, and the quiet tension lingered, but it was balanced by the experience of the day, a full, grounded, real experience of solitude, and the small triumph of enduring it. The cabin had been nothing more than a structure in the forest, yet it had demanded attention, awareness, and patience, leaving me with a clear sense of accomplishment and a memory of an experience that felt both intense and entirely real. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city for a few days, breathe some clean air, and spend time alone with a few books and my thoughts. I spent hours scrolling through listings, comparing cabins in various wooded areas, trying to find something that looked remote but still comfortable. The one I settled on had a few reviews, all positive, with pictures that showed a small, rustic cabin tucked into pine trees with a little clearing in front. The photos made it look inviting, with a stone fireplace and a porch overlooking the woods. I paid the fee, got the confirmation email, and packed my car with a small suitcase, groceries, a thermos, and a couple of blankets I liked to keep around for comfort. The drive was longer than I anticipated. The GPS took me down narrow, winding roads that turned into gravel paths, and I started to notice how little traffic there was. The occasional deer darting across the road reminded me I was far from anything urban. The sun was already starting to dip behind the trees when I finally reached what I assumed was the entrance. There was no sign for the cabin, no markers, nothing but a rough driveway leading to a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. I stopped for a moment, checking the address on my phone, and then drove down the uneven path, hoping it would end at the cabin I had rented. After a few minutes, the trees opened to a small clearing, and there it was. Cabin. Not the cabin I had expected. This one was older, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The porch railings were loose, and the wood looked as if it had weathered decades of storms. I paused, feeling a knot of unease. The pictures had shown something neat and inviting, but this felt abandoned. I checked the email and the address. There was no mistake, this was it, according to what I had booked. My stomach sank a little, but I reasoned that maybe the photos were outdated. The inside looked better in the pictures, and I told myself I could make do for a couple of nights. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and walked up the creaking steps to the porch. The door felt sticky when I pushed it open, the smell of damp wood and old pine hitting me immediately. Dust coated every surface, and spiderwebs draped the corners of the ceiling. I dropped my bags inside, feeling the floorboards sink slightly under my weight. The interior was dark, lit only by the fading sunlight filtering through grimy windows. It had the basics: a kitchen with old appliances, a small living area, and a loft with a bed, but everything felt neglected, as if it had been left to sit unused for years. I checked the fireplace. The grate was rusted, and there were ashes from months ago scattered unevenly across the hearth. I unpacked a few things and tried to convince myself that I could make it work. I lit a small camping stove for dinner, using canned food I had brought along. The cabin felt colder than I expected, even though it wasn't late, and I wrapped myself in a blanket while sitting on the couch. Shadows crept across the walls as the sun disappeared completely. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. It was quiet, too quiet. But I told myself that was the point of this trip, the solitude I had wanted. That first night, I struggled to sleep. The bed was lumpy, the mattress uneven, and the sheets smelled faintly of mildew. Every little sound seemed magnified. The wind rustling through the trees, a branch scraping against the roof, the occasional thump from what I assumed was an animal moving outside. I kept telling myself it was normal, that the woods were alive with small creatures, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was utterly alone in an unfamiliar place, and it wasn't the comforting solitude I had imagined. When I finally fell asleep, I woke a few hours later with the feeling that someone was watching me. I checked the windows. The darkness outside was complete, and the trees pressed in from every side. My heart pounded, but there was no one there, just the forest, endless and indifferent. The next day, I tried to make the best of it. I explored the small clearing outside, trying to appreciate the natural beauty, but I kept noticing details that unsettled me. The ground was littered with broken bottles and old furniture buried in the brush, as if the place had been used and abandoned intermittently over the years. There were paths in the undergrowth, not well-trodden hiking trails, but signs that someone had passed through, maybe even recently. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just part of the rural setting. In the afternoon, I went to light the fireplace. The chimney was blocked with soot, and I had to spend an hour clearing it just to get a small fire going. The effort was exhausting, and by the time it was ready, the room smelled strongly of smoke and mildew combined. I tried to relax with a book, but every time I turned a page, the floor creaked underneath me. The wind moaned through gaps in the walls, and I felt that same creeping sensation of being watched. I realized I hadn't seen another person in hours, maybe since the moment I arrived. The worst part came in the evening. I went to the loft to change into more comfortable clothes, and as I moved across the narrow staircase, one of the boards groaned and cracked sharply. I froze, listening. Nothing. I sighed and continued slowly, but when I reached the top, I noticed a footprint in the dust on the floor near the window. Fresh, unmistakably human. I had been alone, and yet someone else had been there. Panic gripped me. I searched the cabin thoroughly. Every corner, the kitchen, the bathroom, but found no one. I checked the doors and windows, all locked, and realized that if someone had been here, they had entered quietly and left just as quietly. My mind raced with possibilities, and for the first time, I admitted to myself that I had made a mistake. This wasn't the cozy, remote cabin I had imagined. It was neglected, abandoned in parts, and likely used by others without oversight. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, with the stove going, a blanket around my shoulders, every sense alert. The darkness seemed to press against the walls, and every small noise made me tense. I didn't sleep. When morning came, I packed my things quickly, checking the entire cabin one last time. The footprint was gone and nothing else seemed out of place, but I didn't trust it. I didn't stop to eat or even look around the clearing. I drove off the gravel path as quickly as possible, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. Back on the main road, the sun shining and normal traffic around me, I felt the tension leave my body slowly. I stopped at a small cafe to eat and realized how unsafe the previous night had been. Later, I contacted the rental service and explained the situation. They admitted there had been a mix-up. The listing had been switched at some point, and I had been sent to a cabin that was not intended for guests. They apologized, refunded my money, and promised to correct the listing. I felt a sense of closure, though the memory of the cabin lingered. The experience left me shaken, but also wiser about the importance of verifying places before committing, especially when seclusion and isolation are involved. I never returned to that area, and I double-checked every rental after that, making sure I knew exactly what I was getting. The mistake cabin became a lesson in trusting my instincts and recognizing that some places, no matter how picturesque they seem online, are better left undiscovered. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend at the family cabin for months, a break from the constant noise and pressure of everyday life. The cabin had been in the family for decades, nestled deep in the woods, a few miles off the nearest road. The drive alone was a small ordeal, a long stretch of uneven gravel that twisted through thick pine and oak, sometimes narrowing so much that only one car could pass at a time. Every turn seemed to bring a new view of the forest, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their trunks worn smooth by time and weather. When I finally arrived, the sun was just dipping behind the ridges, casting the entire landscape in a muted, amber light. The cabin sat in a small clearing, low and unassuming, with its dark wooden siding and a pitched roof that had weathered countless winters. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, smelling faintly of pine and wood smoke from the small fire that someone must have lit earlier. The air around the cabin was crisp and cold, with the faint scent of wet earth and fallen leaves. I parked the car, listening to the crunch of the gravel under the tires, and took a deep breath. The silence was profound, the kind that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel amplified. A distant bird called somewhere in the trees, and the wind whispered through the branches, rustling dead leaves in the undergrowth. I grabbed my bag and stepped up onto the narrow wooden porch, the boards worn smooth and slightly warped. I pushed open the door, which creaked softly, and entered the cabin. The interior was dimly lit by the fading daylight streaming through the small windows. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in the slanted beams of sunlight. The furniture was sparse but solid, heavy wooden pieces that smelled faintly of old varnish and pine resin. A thick rug covered the floor in the main room, and a small stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now, though I knew it had once provided warmth and comfort during long winter nights. I set my bag down and wandered through the cabin, running my hands over the rough wood of the tables and chairs, noting the small signs of previous occupants. There were a few dishes in the sink, dried crumbs on the counter, a stack of newspapers from last month. Everything had been left in a sort of careful disorder, as though someone had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return. I found the bedroom at the back of the cabin, a small room with a narrow bed, an old dresser, and a window that looked out onto the forest. I set my things down and opened the curtains, letting in the last of the light. The forest beyond was dense and dark, the trees standing close together, their branches forming a near impenetrable canopy. The shadows were long and deep, stretching across the forest floor, and I felt a small, unexplainable prickle of unease as I looked out. It wasn't fear exactly, more a heightened awareness of the isolation, the sheer emptiness of the place around me. I spent the next hour exploring the surrounding area, following a narrow trail that led from the cabin to a small creek. The path was littered with fallen branches and pine needles, soft underfoot, muffling the sound of my steps. The creek was shallow and clear, the water running over smooth stones with a constant, soothing murmur. I leaned over the bank, watching the water swirl around my fingers, and felt a strange sense of peace, almost like the forest was holding its breath around me. I walked back to the cabin as the light faded completely, the woods now a uniform darkness punctuated only by the occasional glimmer of distant stars. The trees became shapes, shadowy and indistinct, and I realized how little I actually knew about the area. I had been there dozens of times before as a child, but now in the quiet, I felt like an intruder, like the forest had grown stranger and more foreign while I had been away. Inside, I made a fire in the fireplace, the smell of burning wood filling the room and making the space feel warmer and safer. I sat in a chair close to the flames, the orange light flickering across the walls, casting shadows that danced and shifted. The cabin felt alive in the quiet way that only old, isolated places can feel, as if every creak of the floor and whistle of the wind was a voice telling a story I couldn't quite understand. I went to bed early, the fire still burning low, and listened to the night outside. The wind moved through the trees, making them groan and creak, and every small sound seemed unnaturally loud. A branch fell somewhere nearby with a sharp snap, and I realized just how alone I was. I slept lightly, waking at odd intervals, my ears straining for the familiar noises of the cabin, the forest, and the distant creek. Every time I stirred, I felt a small, sinking fear, a reminder that I was entirely on my own, far from anyone who might notice if something went wrong. The next morning, I woke to a pale light filtering through the window. The forest was muted, the colors subdued by the thin mist that had rolled in overnight. I made coffee over the small stove and watched as the steam curled upward, the smell of roasting beans blending with the earthy scent of the damp forest. I spent the morning chopping firewood, feeling the cold bite of the air on my hands and the satisfying weight of the axe as it sank into the logs. Each swing echoed through the clearing, and I felt a strange satisfaction in the physical effort, the simple, primal rhythm of splitting wood. I stacked the logs carefully near the fireplace, noting the small cracks and imperfections in the cabin walls, the tiny gaps that let the wind and cold slip in. The imperfections made the place feel real, grounded, and somehow human, not like the polished, lifeless cabins in magazines or advertisements. As the day wore on, I explored further along the trails, taking note of the small details, the way the moss clung to the trees, the broken antlers of a deer tangled in the underbrush, the sound of the creek over the rocks. Every step deepened the sense of isolation, a slow realization that the forest around the cabin was vast and indifferent, existing without regard to my presence. The silence was heavy, oppressive at times, and I felt a small tension building, an awareness that the world beyond the cabin was both beautiful and unforgiving. When evening came, I returned to the cabin and lit the fireplace again. I cooked a simple meal over the stove, the small tasks of preparing food and cleaning afterward grounding me, giving the day structure. As the fire burned low, I sat back in the chair and let my eyes drift over the room, noticing the small changes that had happened since I arrived. Dust had settled differently, shadows had shifted, and the light from the fire made the worn wood gleam in a comforting way. I realized that the unease I had felt was not the result of anything supernatural. but simply the isolation, the unfamiliarity of being alone in a place that demanded attention, a place that refused to be ignored. The weekend passed quietly, each day marked by small routines: collecting firewood, walking the trails, cooking meals, sitting by the fire, and observing the subtle changes in the forest. When it was time to leave, I packed my things carefully, locked the cabin, and took one last walk along the creek. The sunlight filtered through the trees in a way that made everything look softer, more forgiving, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. I understood the cabin differently now, not as a place of fear or danger, but as a space that demanded patience and awareness, a place where the ordinary details of life became sharper and more immediate. Driving away, the gravel crunching under my tires, I looked back at the cabin, feeling a small, lingering sense of gratitude. I had come seeking solitude and left with clarity, a reminder of the quiet, persistent reality of the world around me. I had driven past the cabin dozens of times without thinking much of it, always in a rush to get to the other side of town. It sat at the very edge, where the pavement ended and the trees began to crowd close to the road, casting long shadows even in the middle of the afternoon. I had no intention of ever stopping, but one late October morning, when the sky was low and gray and the air smelled faintly of wet leaves, I found myself pulling into the narrow dirt drive. The cabin was small, squat, and entirely unremarkable at first glance, with weathered wood siding that had faded to a dull brown and a roof streaked with moss. There was a kind of quiet to it, the way a place feels untouched for a long time, though it was clear someone had been there recently. The tire tracks in the mud and the faint scent of wood smoke clinging to the air suggested that. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to it, a curiosity I couldn't easily dismiss. The door was unlocked, and I stepped inside slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light that filtered through grimy windows. The air smelled of damp wood and old fabric, with a faint metallic tang that made the back of my throat tight. It was empty, completely bare except for a threadbare rug in the center of the floor and a small, wooden table pushed against one wall. There were signs that someone had lived here, scraps of newspaper, a bent can of beans tucked under the sink, but nothing recent enough to make the place feel immediately occupied. The walls were stained, paint peeling in long strips near the ceiling, and the floorboards creaked under each cautious step. I could feel the subtle tilt of the house, the way it sagged in places, and it made me uneasy in a way that I couldn't rationalize. I walked through the room slowly, taking note of details: a cracked mirror on the wall, the hinges of the doors rusted and stiff, the fireplace stuffed with soot, blackened logs that looked as though they hadn't been used in years. Everything was silent except for the occasional groan of the cabin settling, a sound that seemed amplified in the still air. Outside, the trees shivered in a light wind, and the shadows moved across the walls in strange patterns. It was the kind of silence that makes you conscious of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the sound of your footsteps echoing unnaturally through the empty rooms. I found a set of stairs at the back of the cabin, leading to a small loft. The railing was loose, and I had to grip it tightly as I climbed, the wood pressing into my hands. The loft was tiny, filled with the remnants of an old bed frame and a few cracked boxes. Dust motes hung in the air, catching what little light came through a small, grimy window. I ran my fingers over the floorboards, feeling them flex slightly under my weight. The ceiling was low, and the walls leaned inward, giving the space a claustrophobic sense of being trapped. I could hear the wind outside rattling the shingles, the distant clatter of a branch against the side of the cabin, and it all combined into a tension I couldn't shake. I went back down, trying to calm myself by examining the kitchen. There were cabinets with peeling doors, a sink with rust staining the edges, and a small stove that had clearly been disconnected for years. The smell of old wood was stronger here, mixed with something faintly sour, like mold hidden under the sink. I opened the fridge out of habit, and the smell that hit me was immediate and pungent, rotted food that had long since been abandoned. It made my stomach twist, and I slammed the door shut quickly, almost spilling my own unease into the room. As I explored, I began to notice small things that didn't quite add up. A door in the back corner of the cabin led to a small storage space, too narrow to stand in comfortably. Inside, there were faint scratches on the walls, irregular, like someone had been trying to move around in there repeatedly. The air was heavier, denser, and it made me swallow hard. I couldn't see any logical explanation for it, just the lingering marks of someone else's presence, recent or not. My mind began filling in gaps, imagining patterns that weren't necessarily there. It was a slow accumulation of unease, each detail pressing in just enough to make the cabin feel alive in a way that was unsettling. I decided to sit for a while at the table, trying to breathe and make sense of the tension. The window above it looked out over the edge of town, the way the trees thinned and the first signs of roads and houses appeared. I could see the fog curling in low patches over the fields beyond, and the late autumn light made the shadows of the trees long and distorted. It was peaceful in one way, almost beautiful, but there was something about the isolation of the cabin, the way it existed at the very fringe of everything, that made it hard to relax. My gaze kept drifting to the corners of the room, to the ceiling beams, to the way shadows clung to the floor, and I felt a constant, nagging sense that I wasn't entirely alone, even though logically I knew I was. I explored the small bathroom, a tight space with cracked tiles and a sink that drained slowly. The toilet had been capped, probably to prevent use, and the mirror above the sink was streaked with age. I ran my hands over the counter, feeling the chipped enamel and the grime in the corners. Everything about the place spoke of abandonment and wear, and yet there were traces of someone's habits lingering faintly in the air, the scent of old smoke and the faint residue of cleaning products that had long since lost their potency. It was human, in a way that made the cabin feel like a shadow of life rather than a home. I eventually left the cabin, stepping back into the chill of the morning air. The trees were close now, branches scraping lightly against the sides of the cabin. The wind carried a faint rustle of leaves, and the dirt driveway squished under my shoes. I stopped at the edge of the property, looking back at the cabin one last time. In the harsh light of day, it looked different, smaller, more fragile, almost pitiful. I realized that the fear and tension I had felt inside weren't the result of anything supernatural, but of the very real, human impressions left in the space. The way it had been neglected, the way it had been lived in and abandoned, the way its structure creaked and shifted with every movement. It was a place shaped by people, and people could leave traces that unsettled long after they were gone. I walked back to my car slowly, taking care with each step over the uneven ground. As I drove away, the cabin shrank in my rearview mirror, framed by the early fog and the skeletal trees. I thought about the curiosity that had drawn me there, about the tangible sense of unease that had followed me inside, and I realized it was nothing more than the effect of isolation, age, and human traces. No ghosts, no monsters, just the tangible, lingering presence of people and time, and somehow that understanding made the experience feel complete, resolved. The cabin had scared me, yes, but it had also reminded me of something very ordinary and human, the way abandoned spaces carry the memory of those who use them, and the way our own minds fill in the emptiness with tension and fear. By the time I reached the highway, the town behind me was fully awake, cars moving, people walking, and the fear that had clung to me began to dissipate. The cabin was just a building, fragile and forgotten, sitting quietly at the end of town. I knew I would think about it again, but without the fear. Only the memory of being there and the strange, quiet weight of a place that had once been lived in and left behind.